Welcome back to Drive Your Thoughts podcast. I'm your host, Master Coach Carrie Marshall, and it's time to go after those goals.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.
Hey, what's up? It's Carrie Marshall. And today what I want to talk to you about is how your story is holding you back. We all have stories that we tell ourselves all the time about what's happening in our lives. And that's fine. That's actually what our reality is made up of. Our reality is actually made up of stories, but the stories can sometimes get in the way. So let me give you an example of this. Last week, I was talking to one of my clients, and she and her husband had gotten in an argument. So as she was talking about this argument and why she was still upset about it, I was listening to her version of the story. Now, if I would have talked to her husband about it, there would have been a different version of the story. And so as I was listening, here's what I'm doing as a coach is I'm really listening for a couple of different things. Number one, I'm listening for facts, and then I'm listening for thoughts or stories is what we like to call it. So there's no problem with stories except for when they start to hold you back. This story, this version that my client was telling herself had actually come and become a problem for her relationship with her husband. They weren't talking to each other. She was finding more resentment build up as she started to add layers into the story. And so I want you to think for yourself about where your stories in your life are holding you back. It might be around your goals. It might be around your business, your relationships. But when we allow the story to actually start to kind of take away from our life, then we have a problem. And so as I was talking to my client, I said, where are you willing to be wrong about your story? Now, I want to say that again because it's so powerful. Where are you willing to be wrong about your story? Stories are going to come and go, but we have to be willing to say that there's a different ending to that story. And so when we went back with my client and we talked about the actual circumstances that had happened in this argument, she was able to say like, wow, yeah, I can see how that's impacting how I'm showing up. And I don't really love that version of my story. I don't love that I'm showing up as a victim in this story, in this place, because it's not serving me and it's not serving my relationship. So we all do this in different parts of our lives where we'll come up and we'll say, here's the story of what happened. Okay, so how is that serving you? So if you are stuck in any area of your life, I want you to look at the version that you're telling yourself. I love looking at the different versions of Cinderella over the years. So Cinderella, a lot of people will tell you that it's a Disney movie, but it's not. It actually started way back before Disney as a Grimm's fairy tale. And so if you can even go back to that version, we can see that there are different stories told different ways. Even in that, you even have newest versions that kind of show different areas and different versions of that story. And so anytime we're talking about a story being told, you have to ask yourself a couple of different questions. Number one, who is the narrator? If we can look at different perspectives of stories, you're going to get really different versions of things that are happening. And so that's the first thing that you want to be really clear about is who's telling the story right now? Who's the narrator of the story? Number two, how do I benefit from this version of the story? So often when I'm talking to my clients and I can see that they're kind of in that victim state, that victim mentality, they're telling themselves that everything is happening to them. I'll ask them like, how does this benefit you? Now they know that the correct answer is like, well, it's not, but I always stop them and say, okay, now that you've given the right answer, how is it really benefiting you? How do you benefit from being the victim here? And if we can get really clear about that and that there's not a right answer, then we can see, well, if I'm not the victim, I don't have to take accountability. I don't have to take action on this. We can actually start to see how maybe being the victim is benefiting you in your life right now. So look at who the narrator is. Ask yourself how this version of the story is benefiting you. And then the third question to ask is, how is this version of the story hurting me? So often we get hurt by our own stories. We get stuck and we stay in this very stagnant place when we tell ourselves that this is the only version of the story. So one of my clients is right in the middle of doing a launch for her business, and it's not going how she wanted it to. And as she told the story, she was telling me how, it's hurting this and she can't figure this out. And it was very much like she could never figure it out and it would never work for her. And so when I asked her, how does this version of the story hurt you? We could start to see that it was something that she could never figure out. And it was almost like the dragon that she couldn't slay in her business. And so when we kind of started to look at it in a different perspective, we started to see that this was one way that she had decided to launch that maybe she needed to do a little bit differently, or that maybe she was getting a lot of knowledge from doing it this way. And it completely shifted how she was looking at her business. We all tell stories. Stories are actually how most of our memories are made up. I know that I've talked to my siblings before about an experience that we've all had, and we all have different versions of the exact same experience. And that's because we are all telling ourselves stories. We have thoughts about what happened. One of us thinks it's so funny. Another one was like traumatized by it, but that's because it's a shared experience, but that doesn't mean that the story is the same. And this is the next thing that I want to mention, is that anytime that we're dealing with stories, we need to allow other people to have their own version of the story. We can get really, really heavily involved with trying to manipulate other people's stories because we want to be right and we want to validate that what we experienced is real. But what I want to offer for everybody is that we can absolutely have a real experience for ourselves and let other people have their own experience as well. So let's go back to that client that was in an argument with her husband. After she talked and coached with me, then she went and talked to her husband, and she said that it was really interesting having the perspective of story and listening to his version. And she said that she was really glad that she was allowing herself to have her story and allowing him to have his story. She had shifted and changed her perspective a little bit. And she said that allowed it to not be like who's right and who's wrong here, but it allowed her to see that both of those experiences could be real. So when we talk about why having these stories are important and why seeing your own story is important, is we really want to come back and say, what is going to be the most beneficial for me? How am I going to up-level my own life by understanding that stories can be changed at any minute? Just because you've had an experience doesn't mean that you can't shift and adjust the story that's being told. And so as you start to look at your own stories, I want you to start to think about, how is this benefiting me and how is it hurting me? And then once again, who's the narrator of the story? Because if we have the wrong narrator telling the story, then we're always going to feel like we're at the mercy of whoever's telling the story. So this is once again why we want to take ownership, that it's okay for us to have one experience and for another person to have a different experience. You have to be willing to be wrong about your own crappy story. So let's talk about what makes a crappy story. Now, I know that a lot of you are like, well, I don't want to be wrong about this. Like, this is who I am and this is what I do. But we have to come back to, if your story isn't serving you in some way that you love, then it's a crappy story. Telling yourself that you can't figure out your business and that maybe just nobody wants what you're offering is a pretty crappy story. We want to be able to be accountable to what we're actually telling ourselves. You are accountable for your stories. That's it. Nobody else is in charge of what you're thinking and how you're feeling. That is all on you. You get to decide what that story is. Now, one of the things that comes up when I'm talking to people about their stories is they say, well, I just don't want to glaze it over. and say like everything works out and everything's fine. And I tell people, absolutely not. Every great story has a hero that has to face challenges and obstacles. So we're not glazing over and saying everything's wonderful and I'm okay with everything. Really great stories include emotion and experiences. And so don't be afraid to say that you've struggled. Don't be afraid to own up to things being hard or to having those really challenging obstacles in your story. That's what makes a great story. We have to be willing to face that experiences happen and they're hard. We have to be willing to say that maybe that's part of the story that has given you the best teaching in your life, is going through those type of experiences. Notice that we're not trying to glaze over and create a polished version of yourself or your life, but what we're trying to do is tell the story in a way that it's not a crappy story, but it's a story of victory and triumph. It's a struggle and maybe an obstacle story, but we have to remind ourselves that you get to tell this story for yourself. So if you find that you have a story that's not serving you right now, I want to offer that it is up to you to change the story. Go back and actually look at what you're telling yourself. And I'm going to give you a really easy example of this. And you can do this with anything that's happened in your life. First, start with the circumstances. So if you had an argument with your spouse, you're going to go back and say, okay, my spouse and I had a conversation last night at dinner. He said this, I said this. Those are all circumstantial things. They're factual things that happened. Now I want you to tell the story. He hurt my feelings. He knows that that's the worst thing that he could say. He went for the jugular with that one comment. Whatever else is going to come up, tell your story, write it down. Next, go back and read your story and highlight the places that are not serving you. Why do you want to tell the story that way? What is it getting you? And do you like that? Find the crappy places. And this is exactly, by the way, how we write actual stories, is we actually go back and see like where in the story is it just not serving the audience? And that's what I want you to think of for yourself. Where is this not serving me? And then remind yourself that you get to tell this story however you want to. And so you absolutely can take ownership of that and start to tell the story a different way. If that one sentence or that phrase that you've been telling the story isn't serving you about that conversation you had with your husband, how else do you want to say it? So if I were to do this with that example, I would say, my husband's hurting and he says things that he doesn't mean sometimes. Or I could say, I took that really personally because I've already had a hard day. So I could see how that one phrase would really feel like it cut me, but really it was just a sentence that was said. Take ownership of your story and accountability that you get to tell the story that you want to, and watch how much you can change your life by changing your story. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you next time on Drive Your Thoughts Coaching. Thanks for listening to this podcast episode. If you're ready to get in the driver's seat of your own life, you can come and follow me at Drive Your Thoughts Coaching on Instagram, or come and see more ways to work with me at driveyourthoughts.com.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.